22-year-old Elizabeth Becker stood in the back of a military truck, towering over thousands of surviving Poles. On July 4, 1946, the crowd gathered on a hill near Gdańsk for one spectacle. Thousands of people filled the grassy field. Ahead of the convoy rose several heavy wooden gallows. Ropes swayed. The Polish government deliberately made this trial public. Executions of this scale were rare in 1946. Many in the audience had personally survived the occupation. Truck engines cut sharply through the summer silence. The vehicles slowly climbed the steep dirt road. Guards armed with rifles walked alongside the tires. Condemned personnel of the Stutthof concentration camp stood closely together in the shaking cargo beds. The execution site was located just 34 kilometers away from the camp. Becker stood among them. She was only 22 years old. She wore no blindfold, staring directly at the massive wooden gallows ahead. The prisoners could not balance themselves. Their hands were tied firmly behind their backs. Thick cords bound their ankles. Becker looked down at the faces of the survivors. They came here to witness justice. This was the physical conclusion of a detailed investigation. A long chain of proven crimes placed her on that exact hill. There was no escape. She had minutes left to live. Executioners moved methodically down the wooden line, securing hemp nooses around the necks of the standing prisoners. No one offered these individuals the mercy of a blindfold, and the judicial framework allowed zero room for last-minute legal appeals. On that afternoon of July 4, 1946, 11 condemned defendants from the Stutthof concentration camp shared the same platform. This public hanging finalized the first war crimes trial against the former camp personnel. Polish prosecutors and authorities deliberately concluded their proceedings through an open demonstration of power rather than a quiet prison procedure. Among those waiting with bound hands for the vehicle engines to engage was Elizabeth Becker. At 22 years old, she had completed the transition from a uniformed guard to a convicted criminal facing a massive crowd. The execution required no specialized mechanical trapdoors to achieve its objective. Instead, it relied entirely on the forward momentum of transport vehicles pulling away from the crossbeams to tighten the ropes. A presiding official verified the final preparations and delivered a sharp hand signal to the waiting drivers. Gears engaged loudly. The transport trucks jerked forward. Survivors' testimonies brought Elizabeth Becker to this specific gallows. How did Polish investigators locate one 22-year-old woman among the ruins? Over 40 million displaced persons moved across Europe in May 1945. She tried to disappear among the millions of refugees. The answer lay in the memories of Stutthof survivors. Filtering this continental flow required methodical work. Polish authorities opened interrogations in cold rooms. Investigators laid out salvaged personnel rosters on wooden tables. Detectives cross-referenced fading paper trails with physical identifications at refugee checkpoints. Becker slipped through the initial screening, pretending to be an ordinary citizen fleeing the front line. But the investigators possessed something stronger than forged travel papers. They had living eyewitnesses. Police eventually arrested Becker and transported her to Poland. She stood trial alongside other former camp personnel. Inside the quiet courtroom, the frail voices of survivors echoed off the walls. They described the sharp ache of daily starvation. Witnesses detailed forced labor and sudden physical punishments. Specific testimonies directly linked the young guard to severe abuse behind the barbed wire. The Stutthof trial stripped away her civilian disguise. The tribunal examined the gathered evidence for several weeks. Undeniable records and direct victim accusations established her guilt. The judge read the death sentence. The sentence marked the end of a flight that began in late 1944. Hiding among civilian refugees became Becker's only survival tactic when the front lines broke. 40 kilometers a day. The Red Army advanced at exactly this speed, pushing German troops back toward their own borders. She shed her uniform and fled. Allied bombers turned German cities into rubble. Supply lines collapsed. The entire East Prussian front crumbled. Stutthof command ordered an immediate evacuation. Guards forced nearly 50,000 inmates out into the winter. The death marches began. Emaciated prisoners walked blindly. Frozen mud and snow crunched under their bare feet. Escorts executed anyone who stumbled. Exhaustion and hunger finished the rest. Thousands of prisoners remained lying on the roads. The mortality on those frozen roads was merely an extension of her daily routine behind the wire. A 21-year-old girl wore no officer epaulets, but she decided which prisoners would live to see the morning. In 1944, Elizabeth Becker arrived at Stutthof. She became one of roughly 3,500 female guards, known as Officerden, operating within the Nazi camp network. Her age stood at exactly 21 years, yet she held total authority over thousands of lives inside the women's section. The daily mechanics of control started before dawn. Morning roll calls echoed across the frozen grounds. Guards shouted 5-digit prisoner numbers into the cold morning air. Then the selection procedure began. Becker walked slowly down the long rows. The guard inspected the silent line of inmates, watching closely for any signs of physical exhaustion. She raised her hand and pointed at the weakened women. Male guards stepped forward and separated them from the rest of the group. This was a bureaucratic execution. A single gesture from her sent a person to their death. She wielded this lethal power at Stutthof, a sprawling complex on the Baltic coast. Today, the empty grounds stand quiet as a memorial. But in 1939, Stutthof's barbed wire scarred Polish soil during the very first hours of the invasion. It was the first concentration camp established entirely outside pre-war German borders. The compound expanded rapidly. What began as a local detention center grew into a massive trap. The SS drove thousands of political prisoners through the main gates. Resistance fighters and targeted civilians filled the yards. Inside, the physical infrastructure was built to break them. Guards packed inmates into severely overcrowded barracks. Watchtowers dominated the coastal skyline. Clean water was rare. Rations remained critically low. Prisoners fought daily against the freezing cold and endless exhaustion. Disease killed faster than starvation. The camp required an expanding garrison of guards to maintain control over the dying population. Total wartime mobilization eventually dragged Elizabeth Becker into this punitive infrastructure. Long before she stood watch over those starving prisoners, Becker peeled endless piles of potatoes. She prepared heavy meals for agricultural workers. She spent her late teenage years surrounded by the loud clatter of porcelain dishes and thick kitchen steam rising from large boiling pots. There was nothing remarkable about her daily routine in the rural canteens. Everything shifted in September 1939. The German military invasion of Poland ignited a continent-wide conflict, tearing civilian administrative structures apart across the region. The free city of Gdańsk, with its population of over 400,000 residents, fell under direct German control. As the war expanded across European borders, the state demanded more resources to sustain the front line. The armed forces eventually conscripted over 17 million men into the Wehrmacht throughout the conflict, sending them to distant battlefields. The cold shadow of perimeter guard towers would soon replace this quiet existence among the rural farming communities. Widespread military conscription left severe labor shortages across the domestic economy, emptying local farms. New government directives demanded immediate solutions to keep the home front producing basic supplies. Women stepped forward and occupied the vacated workplaces. Women stepping into vacated civilian roles was only the final stage. The state forged the readiness to take a spot on a barbed wire watchtower much earlier. The conditioning began at a classroom desk. How did an ordinary cook develop the cruelty required for prisoner selection? The precise answer lay inside the revised school textbooks of 1933. They sang uplifting songs about a bright, prosperous national future. In reality, the regime was preparing these girls to facilitate war crimes. Hitler took power that year. The new regime immediately began dismantling and altering the schools. Propaganda filled daily newspapers, classroom blackboards, and state-controlled radio broadcasts. The curriculum deliberately removed basic human empathy. Teachers presented blind obedience as a national virtue. Biology lessons introduced concepts of racial hierarchy. Like millions of other teenagers, Elizabeth Becker entered the League of German Girls, formerly known as the Bund Deutscher Mädel. By 1936, the government made this membership legally mandatory for all adolescents. The state demanded total control. The indoctrination process was structured, repetitive, and visually striking. Hundreds of girls marched together through city streets in matching uniforms. White blouses and dark skirts created an image of strict unity. They halted in precise geometric formations. The assembly halls echoed with the loud choral recitation of state oaths. Young voices blended into one solid sound. Teenagers swore blind loyalty to the regime. They sang for hours. They memorized government slogans word for word. Independent thought disappeared. The state claimed a total monopoly on their upbringing. Hyperinflation wiped out the savings of an entire generation of Danzig workers. This ideology worked precisely because it found fertile ground in the poverty of the 1920s. The Free City of Danzig stood under the direct administration of the League of Nations. This status turned the territory into a constant zone of political friction. Elisabeth Becker was born into this environment in July 1923. The First World War left a vacuum. Unemployment spread through the streets. Working-class families focused purely on daily survival. Political instability defined the era. The economic collapse built a framework of resentment. State propaganda then filled that void. The 22-year-old girl standing on the Gdańsk gallows was the direct product of 1923 Danzig unemployment.